Release the women from their confidentiality obligations.
So this probably would be known right now if the network had conducted an independent investigation. Last September, early September, you on your show on the air on NBC called for an independent investigation into these allegations. I think we have the tape of you doing this.
But there is a question about whether there should be an outside investigator to take a hard look at this. You know, between the investigation NBC did internally on Matt Lauer to now this, you know, there's the question of the faith and confidence of the public in the reporting of NBC on matters involving itself. And it's, to me, as a lawyer, it's just always better if you just send it outside, and then people can have more faith in it. And if there's nothing to hide, you have no worries about it. You know, you have nothing to worry about.
So people's jaws hung open when you said that. There have been a couple of published accounts that say you were fired from NBC a little more than a month later for saying that. With that in mind, without even having you comment on it, I want to get your response to something that an anchor at MSNBC did 2 nights ago. Chris Hayes addressed the credibility of the president of NBC News directly on his show. He said this.
Oppenheim and others have also maintained since Farrow's departure 2 years ago, the Weinstein story was never broadcast because it lacks sufficient on-the-record sourcing, even after NBC supported Farrow's assignment for 7 months. One thing, though, is indisputable. Ronan Farrow walked out of NBC News after working on the Weinstein story and within 2 months published an incredible article, The New Yorker. The path of least resistance is always there, beckoning seductively with an entirely plausible cover story. You've got bigger fish to fry. This isn't the hill to die on. The story isn't ready. But of course, it's the very ease of that path that makes it the enemy, the kind of work that we as journalists are supposed to do.
He's saying essentially what you said, which is he doesn't trust the management at NBC News. Given your experience, do you think he's in jeopardy of being fired?
No comment on that. But I will say the question is open as to whether they put dollars ahead of decency, about whether they were more interested in protecting their star anchor than they were in protecting the women of the company. There needs to be an outside investigation into this company. They investigated themselves. That doesn't work. No. Fox News had an outside investigator. CBS News had an outside investigator. NPR, the NFL. This is how it's done. You get somebody on the outside who can be trusted. What happened here is you've got Noah Oppenheim, who now they're pulling his college writings where he said women love to be preyed on. Apparently he thinks women love to be preyed upon. Okay, now Noah has said, I deeply regret that, and I'm sorry for what I wrote in college. And people do write dumb-ass things in college.
Of course.
And say dumb things, trust me. But that's the person who's investigating himself. Andy Lack. The reporting that Ronan has put out is that there is an accuser or a woman named Jane Wallace who said she was bullied out of her job when working for Andy years ago. She had a consensual affair with him, but then she says she was retaliated against. And she says he relentlessly preyed on female underlings. If these are the people overseeing the investigation into NBC, right? They had Kim Harris, the general counsel, do the investigation. How are people supposed to trust it? That's why you've got to get somebody on the outside.
Of course, but it's also there's this striking irony. So even as the management of NBC clearly ignored sexual misconduct and abuse within their own building, they seemed to pump up and abet wild and unsubstantiated allegations of sexual misconduct against people whose politics they don't like. So, for example, I watched you on a panel at NBC when you worked there last year on Kavanaugh. It was the last story I think you covered before you left. It was Savannah Guthrie and Lester Holt and Chuck Todd were all on this panel. You were the only person on the panel who held out the possibility that maybe Brett Kavanaugh was not a rapist. Did you feel like the only person who was capable of being objective on that question?
Well, I mean, there's no question that the reporting that was done at NBC on somebody like, let's take Julie Swetnick, who was the completely discredited alleged third accuser against Kavanaugh. This is the woman whose story had, I mean, tons of holes in it. She was, there was a date rape and everybody saw it and then nobody saw it. And she basically imploded on the air. This is an Avenatti client. Remember her?
Yes. Vividly.
They went to air with that story with far less trepidation than they showed in going to air on the Harvey Weinstein story, for which they had tapes. They had tapes. They had witnesses. They had women on the record. Rose McGowan was just one of them. And there is a question of why, right? Was it political, as you suggest here? Was it something else? Was it to protect somebody internally, someone who wasn't the women of the company, right? Because here, What Ronan's suggesting is that they covered up for one sexual predator, Harvey Weinstein, in order to protect another, Matt Lauer. They deny all of this, and NBC has put out several statements saying that Ronan is a conspiracy theorist and this is all nonsense and he's got an axe to grind. But if that's true and there's nothing to hide, then get an outside investigator.
Yeah, if there's nothing to hide. There's more to talk about. We're going to take a quick break.
Okay.
We're not finished. Up next, we'll ask about what appears to be really an epidemic of political journalism in this country and whether the DNC ought to cancel its next debate on MSNBC. Some of the left are calling for that. We'll be right back.